schools.
And to clarify, there is neither public funding. I think that was part of your question too. The home schools and the private schools do not receive public funding.
Correct. And they don't get federal funding. The charter schools don't get federal funding either.
Well, I wonder if, you know, it's the charter school, I mean the home school and the private school children that perform so well on the taxes, on the tests and the things that they do. They win all the spelling bees and the geography bees. So I wonder if perhaps the thing that keeps our public schools back is not the federal Department of Education and the requirements and the regulations. And if that applies to charter schools, then how are they going to overcome that?
I don't know how they do, but they do. I mean, we've got the data that they do. I know that a study came out, and I wanted to address this because it was much touted last week as the legislature was discussing this issue. A study came out that said charter schools don't perform any better than public schools. Well, there were a lot of things wrong with that study, including some statistics that were just flat out wrong. But one of the things that was wrong with it is if you take students from the Atlanta public school, from a school that is failing, that you saw a school on here that said they were talking about their 90% graduation rate, they had a reason to be proud. Those kids came from around Techwood homes, where they have about a 50% graduation rate from their public schools. But anyway, you take a kid from a school that is failing, and you put them into a charter school, you spend the first year or two trying to catch them up with all the things that they have missed over the years, and then they start to exceed the norms after a couple of years. But it does take time to make up for lost time that they've had back there. Ivy Pratt, the school in Gwinnett County that was featured in the movie, they have excellent results. They're scoring in the 90 percentile. They are out of South Gwinnett and North DeKalb counties. Very poor performing school systems. So to take a child from Atlanta public school that went to a charter school and had to spend 2 years catching up and compare their performance with a kid in a suburban school that's doing well doesn't make sense. You should compare them to the schools that they came from.
Apples to apples.
Yeah.
Question in front.
Yeah. Michael Haneke, talking about the federal regulation stuff. Recent statistic that I heard, 70% of the bureaucracy comes down from the federal government. We only get about 5% funding that way. A little bit of an unbalance there, and yet that's what we keep hearing is it's the bureaucracy, it's the bureaucracy, it's all what I kept hearing. But yet, what do? We turn right around for a $400 million carrot we signed on to Race to the Top, which now regulates us now to do Common Core. And now just recently we just said, hey, let's do this waiver, sounds wonderful and everything. But also with that, we just signed on even more to, so what are we going to do when we just signed on and here we have this Common Core curriculum that we have to now abide by come 2014-15?
I've talked to some superintendents and former superintendents of school systems, and it would be very interesting if every school system had to do this, to actually weigh the cost of receiving the federal money because of the regulatory burden that it places in the extra money that's spent in school systems. And I've actually had some superintendents and former superintendents said it would be painful at first, but we would actually save money by not taking the federal money, because it's with the federal money the regulation comes. If the school system doesn't take the federal money, then the regulation doesn't, they're free from those regulations. But I would like to see some school systems actually enact that, because many I've had several tell me that they believe that if they were actually to stop taking federal money, they would actually have more money to spend in the classroom for a child. And one of the things that, back to something that Frank said back here, one of the reasons that we're having the issue that we have now, it goes right back to the answer to the question, or the response that we get out of this system. I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about a system, is exactly what we heard before, is if we have school choice, where's the money going to go? We're not going to get the money. It isn't how can we educate that child better? The response is always, where's the money going to go? It's because we're defending a system. They are defending a system that is focused on the system itself, not upon the child. And that's big. If you look at the funding has gone the last 3 decades from $1,000 per student to over $9,000 per student. And that's with inflation already calculated in there, from $1,000 to $9,000 per student, but we have had zero increase and actually seen a decrease in the education value for that spending.
And we know that we know in the private sector that the regulation drives up costs. In 2009, the government spent $55 billion enforcing compliance on the private sector. The private sector, in turn, spent $1.8 trillion in 2009 alone complying with the government regulations that were handed down. Now, that's across the board, but we know that overwhelmingly regulation drives up costs in the private sector, so it would stand to reason that would also be the case in the education system.
I just want to add on to that. I think you've touched on a broader issue that a lot of us have talked about, and that is where the sovereignty lies, is whether the states are in fact sovereign, as our Constitution provides, or whether we are just appendages of the federal government. And I heard then Congressman Deal, now Governor Deal, say a couple years ago that people who complain about the federal government having taken our sovereignty away have it wrong. The federal government did not take our sovereignty. We sold it a little bit at a time. And so to get it back is going to take some painful belt tightening at the state level. And I, for one, will go on the record as saying I would support a measure, or I would support changes to our budget or changes to our law that would allow us to say no thank you to some of that federal education spending and cut some of those ties and get rid of some of that regulation.
One thing I would try not to hog the mic, but this has really hit an interesting subject. If you look at our federal deficit, it is unsustainable. Our nation is on its way to bankruptcy. I mean, even the most naive person is beginning to be concerned about the debt this nation has incurred. One of the things that one of my colleagues in the Senate and I began discussing is, at some point, the federal government is going to have to get their spending under control. There's no other choice, or we will go bankrupt as a nation. We are going to have to cut spending. Where are those cuts coming from? I would suggest to you the federal government is first going to start looking at cutting the money they're sending to the states. So with that in mind, we started looking, and we are still looking at the amount of federal dollars that are coming into the state of Georgia. And what are we going to do when all that federal money goes away and we're holding all this? We have to fund all these things on our own. What are we going to do when the Medicaid dries up? And with this subject matter, what are we going to do when the educational funding is cut? Well, I submit we'll do a whole lot better, at least for the kids. But we have to prepare for that now. And exactly what Representative Coomer said, as the legislature, we're going to have to man up. And we're going to have to start looking at that now. And I agree with him 100%. I think it's time for us to start cutting that umbilical cord from the federal government and the constraints that are placed upon us from the federal spending.
Got a question, Daryl?
Going back to the question about why the charters are doing better, they're a public school as well, but do they not have their own board that is more responsive to the parents than even the local school board? I mean, would that not maybe be part of the answer?
That is true, and that's part of the local question as well. They not only have a local school board, they have a school board within their school that is elected by the parents of the students in that school. So I have a very good friend, Rich Thompson, who was in the movie, and he told me that in their school there was a program they had that was working, but it cost a good bit.